In the 2021 offseason, the Chicago Bulls were one of the most active teams on the market by executing a sign-and-trade for Lonzo Ball, signing free agent Alex Caruso to a 4-year deal, and then, of course, the big one, making a sign-and-trade for DeMar DeRozan, which part of that sign-and-trade included sending the San Antonio Spurs a first-round pick in 2025, top 10 protected, which was the third first-round pick the Bulls had shipped out in the span of a few months. When you add in the 2 picks the Bulls shipped to Orlando in exchange for Nikola Vucevic. Now, at that time, among Bulls fans anyway, there was a lot of excitement with all of these big moves the Bulls were making because after so many years of rebuilding, this new front office said, we're not going to do that anymore. We're going to compete now and make this franchise relevant again. But a lot of non-Bulls fans, as well as the media, question whether these moves actually made sense for the Bulls, more specifically the fit between Zach Lavine and DeMar DeRozan. A lot of people were critical in the fact that you put 2 ball-dominant, heavy-volume scorers together who aren't that great on defense, and it's a recipe for disaster. Well, of course, the season started out incredibly well. DeRozan had this insane resurgence to the point where he was a top MVP candidate, and then the fit between Lavine and DeRozan looked very seamless. That is, until teams started figuring out how to play against the Bulls. Of course, it didn't help that Lonzo Ball went down and has yet to return, but as the season wore on, and of course throughout this season, it's becoming more and more clear that this duo isn't going to work together. Both incredible players, extremely talented scorers, but sometimes chemistry and offensive schemes between players don't work. And when that happens, you have to make adjustments as a result of it. And so in this video, we're going to be talking about why the Bulls are going to need to choose between Zach Lavine and DeMar DeRozan this offseason, and which player would they be better off keeping between the two. So what's going on, everyone? You're listening to Bulls Central here. Hope you're all doing well. Now, I think we can all agree that it was frustrating to see the Bulls not make a single move at the trade deadline after what we saw this season. It doesn't take a basketball genius to see that this team the front office has constructed doesn't work. Yes, their plans were derailed because of what happened to Lonzo Ball. Yes, Vucevic hasn't panned out maybe as well as they thought. And even Zach Lavine has regressed a bit from his first All-Star season. And yes, it's also easier said than done trying to make changes when clearly the roster doesn't work. I'm not giving the front office a pass or excusing their missteps. If you've been following the channel, you already know that I've been very critical of this front office, but we also have to understand that it just isn't easy to simply move players by snapping your fingers. It's why we don't have jobs in a front office in the NBA. Trading them and getting maximum value in return is very difficult. But either way, based on what we have seen, based on the fact that this roster needs a massive shakeup so they don't set the franchise back for years to come, they have to decide between Zach Lavine and DeMar DeRozan. Now, in a vacuum, I think most people will agree that DeMar DeRozan is the better player between the two if you're just looking at it, again, in a vacuum, so to speak. Although, the way Zach has been playing more recently compared to DeMar could actually change that perspective, but we'll try not to use recency bias here. Not factoring in age, not factoring in their contracts, but just a straight side-by-side comparison what each individual player brings to this team. DeRozan is the better player. Not saying he's leaps and bounds better than Lavine, but he is the better overall player as they currently stand. Now, I think the question you have to ask yourself if you're the Bulls, well, it's a few things. Which player is going to get us the most value in return in the form of a trade? What move would actually set up the franchise for success both for the short and long term? And which player is going to complement the style of basketball we want to play more? So let's talk about value first. Who's going to be the one that's going to give you the most trade value? Now, of course, there was this rumor floating around at the trade deadline that the Bulls and the Knicks were discussing a trade for Zach Lavine in which the Knicks would send the Bulls, I believe it was Obi Toppin, Quentin Grimes, Derrick Rose, Evan Fournier, the last 2 being salary filler, and 3 unprotected first-round picks. Now, this was reported by Joe Cowley, so take that with a grain of salt. And when I had Casey Johnson on the channel shortly after the deadline, I asked him about this and whether there was any truth to it, and he said the Bulls and Knicks were in some talks on a trade about a week prior to the deadline, but that he hadn't heard anything regarding a trade for Zach Lavine in the day leading up to the deadline or any specifics regarding the trade. And I don't know about you guys, but I certainly trust Casey Johnson as a credible reporter versus someone like Joe Cowley. But be that as it may, you can assume that based on what players are fetching around the NBA for all-star level talent, which I know Zach Lavine wasn't an all-star this season, but he's still at that talent level given his overall production, and the fact that you also have to consider his age at 27 being in the peak of his prime, you can assume that Zach netting 3 first-round picks, maybe a young player, another salary filler, is probably a fair return for a team that is in need of an offensive weapon. Now, that trade specifically, that was rumored leading up to the deadline with the Knicks, probably is a bit too much for someone like Zach Lavine. Like, if you're the Bulls, you jump all over that trade all day, every day. 3 unprotected first and 2 young players, one of which I still think has more upside potential in Quentin Grimes. Yeah, sign me up. And that's no disrespect to Zach Lavine, because he's a hell of a player and was the first All-Star on this Bulls team since Jimmy Butler, but that's a massive haul for someone like Zach Lavine, and probably an overpay on the Knicks' part, which, if this proposed trade was in fact true, is probably why it never went down, because the Knicks likely weren't willing to part with that much for Zach Lavine, who's having a bit of a down year and has struggled to actually be a winning player across his career. That being said, though, I do think, given Zach Lavine's age, the fact that, yes, he is having somewhat of a down season, although he's more recently having a bit of a resurgence, he's still an elite scorer. He's still a versatile scorer in that he's quick and athletic and getting to the basket, can shoot it from mid-range, but also shoot it from deep on a solid clip. I do think Zach Lavine can get you 3 first-round picks, especially when you consider how much teams have been willing to trade for all-star level players like DeJounte Murray, Rudy Gobert, and Donovan Mitchell. I mean, Zach Lavine probably isn't worth 3 first-round picks, but that's the NBA trade market right now for all-star players. It's insanely high compared to what it used to be. So yes, I think Zach Lavine can get you 3 first-round picks and maybe 1 young role player, possibly an older role player. Again, you're also going to have to take on some bad contracts for salary filler purposes, hopefully expiring contracts, which would make the trade even better, because then it would free up a ton of cap space for the following season, as you would free up a max spot. But that's what I believe would be Zach's overall trade value. 3 first-round picks, you can probably get another serviceable player or 2 in that. If you're getting 3 first-round picks, you're likely not going to get some additional young talent with upside potential. At that point, a team isn't going to be willing to give up that much for Zach Lavine, but really the prize here would be the 3 first-round picks, considering the Bulls really don't have many first-round picks to work with for the foreseeable future. Now for DeMar DeRozan, what's his trade value? You're talking about a veteran player, an elite level scorer, a great clutch player, 6-time All-Star, was selected, 2nd team All-NBA last season, arguably one of the best mid-range players in the game of basketball right now, and on a contending team could certainly use a player like him to get you over the hump as that second option next to a superstar. Obviously, the downsides to DeMar's trade value: 1 is his age, 33 years old. Who knows how long you're going to be able to get prime DeMar like we're seeing right now. We all know, as lethal as he is from mid-range, he doesn't really fit in today's NBA that is predicated on 3-point shooting and floor spacing. Not the best defender, and he can get tunnel vision in playing ISO-heavy ball, which slows down the overall offense. He will be going into an expiring contract next season, which I guess you can either add as a plus or a negative, in the sense that a team may or may not want him on a 1-year rental. But unlike Zach Lavine, it makes a player like DeMar easier to move, as teams might be a little more unwilling to take on Zach Lavine's max contract that will still have 4 years left on his deal after the season. But all of that said, DeMar still has a lot of trade value. It's not like he's a washed player due to still balling, was an all-star yet again this season, and is putting up over 25 points per game on 51% shooting. So it's hard to estimate DeMar's value. He likely wouldn't get you as much as someone like Zach Lavine, given he's older. It's not like he's a player you can really build around, and I'm sure some teams are looking at the Bulls right now and seeing that there is a reason this team isn't playing well, and a lot of it has to do with DeRozan limiting their flow of offense in 3-point shooting. But because DeMar is a bucket getter, a savvy veteran, and you never know if there's going to be teams willing to overpay to go all in on being contenders, you likely could get 1 or maybe even 2 first-round picks, probably 2 if there's some protections on said picks, and maybe another young player to go with it, and some salary filler. Although the salary filler isn't as much as you would need for someone like Zach Lavine, given his overall contract is a lot higher. So for the Bulls, again, this is speculating on Lavine and DeRozan's perceived trade value around the league based on their current trade market. For the Bulls, you have to decide, what's the direction? Do we give up some older players, sacrifice some star talent now, and get some trade assets in return in the form of draft picks, and truly build around Zach Lavine with your young players with future draft picks as well? Or do you move your star player that's in his prime, that you just gave a max contract to, you keep your veteran players in DeMar and Vucevic, and continue building and developing your younger players while also getting a sizable haul of draft capital for the future in return, and freeing up cap space by getting Zach's contract off the books, which, for the record, if the Bulls do in fact trade Zach Lavine, you'd have to think there is a world in which they would just trade DeMar DeRozan as well, because at that point, you might as well blow up the roster rather than have this weird timeline of aging veterans and very young players with no players bridging the gap between the two. But for the purposes of this video, we're just going to say the Bulls are going to decide between the two. But either way, it's a hard decision, because on one hand, you can likely get more for Zach because he's younger. Unlike DeMar, he fits the mold of today's NBA and shooting threes at a solid rate. But again, trading Zach Lavine, you're trading a star level player in their prime. But then if you trade DeMar instead, you're moving a player who might not get you the same level of value, but he's certainly going to get you a fairly sizable return for a player who isn't going to be a part of your long-term future. He's going to be on an expiring contract, so you're getting assets in return for him rather than letting him walk in free agency next offseason. That is key. And then you still have Zach Lavine, player in his prime. Maybe without DeMar, he goes off to being that Zach Lavine that we saw a couple years ago, who was one of the most efficient players in the NBA. And to be honest, he's starting to show flashes of that now. Like, it's tough, and obviously there are so many factors at play here, right? Do the Bulls re-sign Vucevic? Does Lonzo Ball actually come back healthy to start the season next year? Do they actually miss the playoffs and somehow get lucky and land a top pick in this year's draft? So many factors can change this and the outlook of this team going into the offseason. But between the two players, in my view, if you had to choose which one to trade, it's Zach Lavine. And I say that because, again, you can likely get more for Lavine, much more in return. And it seemed like the Knicks will surely overpay after they get bounced in the first round of the playoffs. They have a lot of draft capital, so the Bulls can take some of that. You're also getting Zach's contract off the books, which, as good as Zach is, isn't as favorable of a contract as one might like. And towards the end of that deal, it's likely going to be a contract that will get harder and harder to move. DeMar is on an expiring deal, so it frees up a ton of space for the future with less guaranteed money on the payroll. And at the end of the day, the front office's biggest mistake thus far wasn't the Vucevic trade and doing the sign and trade for DeMar, or moving on from Lauri Markkanen, or signing Lonzo Ball. It's not even the fact that they gave Zach a max contract, because it's better to give him the max and trade him later on if needed than have him walk for nothing. It was the fact that they prioritized building around Zach Lavine, making all the moves to ensure that they could retain Zach and build a franchise around him as their franchise player, when, as great as Zach is and has been, he's just not on that level. He's not a franchise level player, nor is he a player that you sacrifice draft picks and young players to build around. He's just not. And I know I've been saying this for a while now, dating all the way back to when I first started the channel. Zach is not a #1 option on a championship team. He probably isn't even a #2 option on a championship team. And until the Bulls front office recognizes that and makes adjustments accordingly, especially when he has a high trade value, you're not going to see this team do much. Now, if his trade value maybe isn't that high and I'm way off in estimating his perceived value, like say a team is only willing to shell out 1 first-round pick and a young player or 2, then no, you pass on that instance and you absolutely trade DeMar DeRozan instead. But I can almost guarantee you there will be a few teams out there willing to overpay for Zach Lavine, much more than any team would be willing to pay for DeMar DeRozan. And as such, I think it would make more sense to trade Zach, do a bit of retooling, have some assets to build for the future, but also still have the pieces for the present. That's just my opinion. I would love to hear what you guys think. Which player would you rather trade between the two? Let me know in the comments, and as always, be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.